America's debt is spiraling faster than ever now, and that is a problem that threatens the financial safety of all of its citizens. Although it may not feel like it at present, the level of debt the country has is now at the point where it may become unfeasible to protect ourselves from further systematic shocks, either foreign or domestic, in the future. It could potentially lead to decreased economic growth, decreasing private investment, and lowering wages and employment over the long term. We have seen throughout history the boom and bust cycles of economic powerhouses such as Spain. The Netherlands and Britain go through cycles of great prosperity, then succumb to the effects of economic overexpansion by heavy borrowing for wars, maintaining territories, and faulty financial planning. It is not a matter of if the nation will fail, but when. As long as human civilization has existed, this seems to be a natural phenomenon that affects all great nations, no matter how much they may try to avoid it. The question we are posing is, what is the level of debt that takes a nation beyond the fiscal cliff, and what threat it presents to the nation in terms of ability to pay its debts, affect employment, and economic investment? And how does it tie back into the situation we have in the U.S.? It's time to dive into the potential pitfalls that America's current path is leading itself into, and what to expect, and what will come out of the end result of our debt spiral. First, let's explore the countries that came before who have followed a similar path. The U.S. is currently headed starting with the Netherlands. In the 17th century, the Netherlands reached the height of its cultural and economic wealth. Bolstered by the company that embodied and carried the might of the nation on its shoulders, the Dutch East India Company was a virtual monopoly that mainly engaged in the spice trade throughout Asia. At the height of its economic impact, if valued in today's dollars, the company would be valued at over $7 trillion. So how did its vast wealth crumble? As we mentioned before, the bust that comes after the boom is usually caused by countries over-leveraging debt to fund expansion or wars. And so it was with the Netherlands during the 18th century. At the time, they had a contentious rivalry with the British Empire that led to various conflicts, including war with the now dominant superpower. The British Empire had now surpassed the Dutch Empire. Through naval superiority, it was able to disrupt the trade network of the Dutch Empire. This was added strain on its system that made it difficult to hold on to economic superiority. Their disputes culminated in the Anglo-Dutch War, which resulted in significant naval losses for the Dutch. In an effort to maintain its empire and influence, they had to take out significant loans from the Bank of Amsterdam. The ballooning debt further eroded its economic sufficiency. In summary, the fact that they had lost significant territory from the British, which reduced the scale of its empire and global trade routes, plus the significant loans they took, decreased its ability to effectively expand its economy. The end result was a greatly diminished Netherlands that fell out of global dominance by the turn of the 18th century. A nation that has been relegated to a regional power within its small sphere of influence now. Taking a more recent example, we'll see how the British Empire rose and fell. As we explained, the nation had become the dominant superpower during the 18th century. It established its position with superior naval power, with which it used to wrest economic superiority from the Dutch Empire by establishing and expanding superior trade routes, setting up territories around the world so vast that there was a saying, "The sun never sets on the British Empire." This phrase alluded to the fact that the British Empire spanned across so many continents that there was always daylight touching at least some part of it at any given time. Through these territories, they were able to import natural resources that enriched itself, oftentimes at the expense of these territories. They enjoyed a very lucrative moment in time where they could impose their economic dominance over other countries. Simultaneously, they were able to establish themselves as the world's reserve currency that gave it the same advantages that America now has. It was able to borrow money at lower interest rates since other nations facilitated trade in British pounds. It provided a compounding effect that let it fund its expansion with debt and then further gain footholds in new territory through which it was able to gain more resources. This British Empire's expansion was halted after the advent of the World Wars that threatened to cripple all of Europe, which involved a heavy amount of borrowing to fund the war effort. It also lost significant manpower due to the war by approximately 4 million men. The aftermath of the war weakened its global empire and industrial base. An estimated 10% of Britain's domestic assets were destroyed during the war, along with 24% of its overseas assets. And this allowed both America and Japan to grow economically to rival Britain. With a deteriorated economy, it had to borrow further to maintain what territories it had left. The final blow to the legacy of the British Empire would end up being during World War II. Still reeling from the aftermath of the First World War, it was reluctant to enter into another war with Germany, but it was left no choice after Germany's invasion of Poland 2 days earlier. Because it knew it would eventually be the next target of the new German Empire, it mobilized its economy to convert itself into a war economy to stand against Germany. Now, we are not a channel that goes in depth about war, so we will just talk about the financial outcome of Britain's involvement in the war. In short, the British Empire was devastated and became a shell of its former self. It had to take out substantial loans on top of the heavy debts it already took for the First World War. This increased borrowing to the country's debt to 250% of GDP. The financial turmoil led to the nation losing its territories that became too expensive to maintain. And lastly, Britain lost the privilege of having the world's reserve currency to the US. This means that it could no longer borrow at low costs and could not use its gold reserves since America owned most of the global gold supply. This is because they became the world's creditors to supply munitions and took gold as payment from the member nations allied with the Allied powers. And so it goes that their economy never again reached the heights that it had during the 18th and 19th century relative to other countries like America and China today. This brings us to the American economy. At this point in time, the US is still the undisputed economic superpower, but its influence has been waning lately, as there now seems to be a shift into a new multipolar world where it now has to share superpower status with other rising stars such as China. Before that, we will go through what has led the US to where it is today. During the Second World War, while Europe was being torn apart by the fighting, the US was able to bolster its economic power by shifting into a war economy and building up its armaments and selling weapons to the Allied powers. Instead of paper currency, which was going through massive fluctuations, it instead accepted gold for payment. Through most of the war, America had accumulated the largest amount of gold reserves in the world, and its domestic policies reduced unemployment to 10%, down from the peak of 25% during the Great Depression. Being the only major player that wasn't ravaged after the war, it was able to take advantage of its advantageous position to become the largest creditor nation after the war, to help restore the war-torn nations back to health. In addition, they were able to call upon member nations during the Bretton Woods Agreement that made the US dollar the world reserve currency. This meant that instead of global currencies being pegged to gold like it had always been, it would now be pegged to the US dollar, which in turn was pegged to gold as a stand-in. This gave the dollar the advantage of lower borrowing costs. Since it was seen as a safe haven asset, it gave the country access to global markets and resilience to economic market shifts. The latter is done by allowing the US to export its inflation across the globe by allowing other countries to buy its bonds, which gives it the liquidity to stabilize markets. We can see examples of this during the 2008 global economic recession and the 2020 coronavirus outbreak. The US was essentially able to print its way out of the economic slump by borrowing trillions of dollars cheaply to boost economic output domestically, or buying distressed assets off the books of mortgage lenders during the Great Recession. The economic power of the United States cannot be overstated. For decades, it was the preeminent superpower throughout the world. But what about now? How is the economy of the United States? Every nation before us has gone through boom and bust cycles. It is an inevitability that afflicts every powerful nation seemingly without fail, and the US is no exception to the rule. From the 1950s throughout most of the late 2000s, the economic cycle has shifted from an unprecedented boom cycle built on debt to now a cycle where we are now seeing depreciating returns for government spending. The truth is, the US is now going through a debt spiral, one that doesn't seem to have a solution, or at least a solution that is politically feasible. America is $38 trillion in debt, and it is growing at an alarming rate. The debt to GDP ratio is now above 120%. This is a debt ratio not seen since World War II. We have now surpassed the debt ratio of our wartime economy, which many thought was not possible. It may seem like an arbitrary number at first, but this presents a real and present danger to the economy. At over 120%, this means that a country's public debt is greater than its economic output, which can signal potential difficulties in repaying its debts and may lead to higher borrowing costs. Just a few months ago, the credit rating of the U.S. was downgraded by Moody's and signaled for the first time in over a century after repeated failures that the country might have trouble controlling its growing debt. This came with a slew of negative side effects. We mentioned increased borrowing costs were a side effect of the debt spiral. After the credit rating downgrade and a failure to attract potential buyers, it was forced to increase rates on treasuries. This is an added expense it must pay on top of its already massive spending. The House recently passed a bill that would further add over $2 trillion more to the national debt. To make matters worse, the U.S. is paying interest on the national debt that is projected to reach $970 billion in 2025. And that number is only growing. For example, in only 71 days, the national debt has grown by over $1 trillion, and $383 billion of that was during the 35 days covering the government shutdown. This is not sustainable. At some point, the government debt will spiral beyond the control of the nation to manage. The interest payment on the national debt is projected to reach 3.2% of GDP in 2025. If it continues through 2035, the cost to service the debt will reach 4.1% of the national debt. Where does all this leave us now? Unless political will shifts to enacting real solutions to fix this problem, it is likely that the debt will continue to spiral out of control. The growing interest payments on the debt, along with growing spending on programs such as Social Security and Medicare, will engulf spending that could go towards infrastructure projects or research and development programs that keep the U.S. technologically ahead of its rivals. What will the outcome look like? It's hard to say, but I think it's reasonable to expect that the world will shift into becoming a multipolar world in which there are nations of equals. The power of the U.S. will eventually wane and will no longer be able to project its power, influence the globe like it does now. It's possible, like Britain, Spain, and the Netherlands that came before, the bust may not necessarily be chaotic, but just a gradual decline over decades. Time will tell. But what we can do is take lessons from what is happening to see where we can do better in the future, or maybe avoid some mistakes altogether. If you've watched this far, thank you for listening. Don't forget to comment your thoughts on this issue, and please like, share, or subscribe.